Something is spreading across China right now that the Communist Party never prepared for. Not a virus, not a protest, not a political movement with leaders and demands and rallying cries that the security apparatus can identify, infiltrate, and crush. Something quieter, something more personal, something that is moving through Chinese society like water moving through cracks in stone, finding every weakness, every gap, every space where control does not quite reach. And Beijing, with all its surveillance cameras and its internet filters and its neighborhood committees and its vast and sophisticated apparatus of social control, has no idea how to stop it. Because you cannot arrest an idea, you cannot sentence a feeling to prison, you cannot place an emotion under house arrest or delete it from the internet before it has already spread through 100 million private conversations. What is spreading across China right now is something the Communist Party fears more than any foreign military threat, more than any economic sanction, more than any political opposition movement. It is the decision made by millions of ordinary Chinese people to stop trying, to stop performing loyalty they do not feel, to stop chasing dreams the system has made impossible, to stop pretending that the social contract still exists when the evidence of its collapse is visible in every aspect of daily life. This movement has a name, several names actually, because it has emerged organically in different forms across different communities, each one expressing the same underlying reality in slightly different language. And by the time you understand what it actually is, what is driving it, what it means for China's future, and why Beijing is more afraid of this quiet spreading feeling than it is of almost anything else, you will understand why some of the most serious analysts of Chinese politics are saying that what is happening right now inside China could be the most significant internal development in that country since Tiananmen Square. Let us start with the word that started it all, Tang Ping. In Mandarin, it means lying flat, literally the image of a person who has simply stopped. Stop striving, stop competing, stop participating in the exhausting, all-consuming race that Chinese society has demanded of its young people for decades. The lying flat movement emerged publicly around 2021 when a young Chinese man posted an essay online explaining his decision to stop working beyond the minimum necessary to survive. No career ambitions, no pursuit of marriage or home ownership, no children, no consumption beyond basic needs, just the minimum required to maintain biological existence, redirected toward personal peace. The post resonated with a speed and intensity that shocked everyone, including the person who wrote it. Within days, it had been shared millions of times. Within weeks, it had generated a nationwide conversation. Within months, it had become a cultural phenomenon that the Communist Party was desperately trying to suppress, scrubbing the phrase from social media platforms, instructing state media to condemn it, and directing officials to lecture young people about the importance of hard work and national contribution. But you cannot unsay something that millions of people already feel in their bones. The censors could delete the posts. They could not delete the reality that produced them. And the reality that produced lying flat is something that Chinese young people live every single day. To understand what is driving this movement, you need to understand what life actually looks like for a young Chinese person in 2025. Not the China of state media broadcasts and Olympic opening ceremonies and gleaming new infrastructure. The China of a 26-year-old university graduate in a second-tier city with a degree that costs their family everything, competing for jobs that pay wages that cannot cover rent in the city where the jobs exist, watching housing prices that have risen so far beyond any realistic connection to wages that home ownership has become not just difficult, but mathematically impossible for most young Chinese people. The numbers are genuinely staggering. Youth unemployment in China hit a record high of over 21% in 2023, at which point the government simply stopped publishing the data. Stopped. The statistics became so embarrassing that the official response was to make the statistics disappear. But the young people whose unemployment the statistics were measuring did not disappear. They are still there. Tens of millions of them. Educated, digitally connected, globally aware, and acutely conscious of the gap between what the system promised them and what it has actually delivered. China's education system spent decades telling its young people that if they studied hard enough, competed hard enough, sacrificed enough of their childhoods to the brutal Gaokao examination system, they would be rewarded with a path to a prosperous and meaningful life. Chinese families poured everything into that promise. Parents worked themselves to exhaustion. Grandparents contributed life savings. Children gave up play, friendship, sleep, and youth itself in pursuit of the educational credentials that were supposed to be the ticket to a better future. And then those credentials were not enough, because everyone had them. Because the economy had not created enough high-quality jobs to absorb a generation of university graduates. Because the system that promised meritocracy had, like every system that promises meritocracy while operating in the real world, produced something very different from what it advertised. What it produced was a generation that worked harder than any previous generation in Chinese history. sacrificed more, competed more intensely, and arrived at adulthood to find that the prize they were promised either did not exist or had been claimed by people with the right family connections, the right hometown registrations, the right relationships with the right officials. This is the kindling, and lying flat was the first spark. But here is where things take a deeply significant turn, because lying flat was just the beginning. The movement has evolved. It is fractured into multiple streams, each one representing a different expression of the same fundamental rejection of the system's demands. After lying flat came bai lan. In Mandarin, it means let it rot. If lying flat was passive withdrawal, let it rot is something more deliberate, more conscious, more pointed in its rejection. Let it rot says not just that the individual is withdrawing from the competition, but that the competition itself is corrupt and worthless. That the entire social and economic framework that demands sacrifice and delivers nothing is not worth engaging with at all. That the appropriate response to a rigged game is not to play harder, but to refuse to play entirely, and to refuse loudly enough that others can see the refusal and understand why. Let it rot spread through Chinese youth culture with a speed that genuinely alarmed Communist Party officials. It appeared in memes and social media posts before the censors could catch them, in private conversations and group chats that intelligence services struggle to monitor at scale, and in the increasingly open behavior of young Chinese people who have stopped pretending to care about outcomes they no longer believe in. Young Chinese professionals describe showing up to jobs they hate and doing the absolute minimum required to not be fired. Not because they are lazy, but because they have consciously decided that additional effort produces no additional reward in a system where advancement depends on factors entirely outside their control. Young Chinese consumers describe choosing not to buy, not to participate in the consumption economy that the party depends on for growth figures, precisely because consumption feels like cooperation with a system that has failed them. And then came the most politically charged expression of this movement yet, the return to the village. Thousands of young Chinese people, many of them university graduates with urban jobs and urban expectations, have begun leaving China's major cities and returning to rural areas, not because rural life is economically attractive, not because agriculture is suddenly profitable, but because the cost of urban life has become so crushing, so relentlessly consuming of time, energy, money, and psychological health, that the relative poverty of rural life feels preferable to the specific kind of suffering that urban competition demands. They are documenting this return on social media platforms in short videos and essays and live streams that have generated tens of millions of views before censors intervene. The content is not overtly political. It does not criticize the party by name. It simply shows the reality of a choice that increasing numbers of young Chinese people are making. And that reality is a devastating implicit indictment of the system that produced it. Because when educated young people with urban credentials choose poverty in the countryside over competition in the city, they are making a statement that no state media campaign can fully drown out. They are saying, with their feet and their cameras and their quietly devastating honesty, that the system has failed them so completely that abandoning it is the rational choice. Beijing understands the message, and Beijing is terrified by it. Here is why the Communist Party is so frightened by a movement that involves no violence, no political demands, no organized leadership, and no direct challenge to party authority. The Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy has rested since the economic reforms of the 1980s on a very specific promise. The promise of improvement. The social contract of the reform era said, essentially, that the party would deliver rising living standards, expanding economic opportunity, and a path toward the kind of prosperity that Chinese people could see in neighboring countries like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. In exchange, the Chinese people would accept restrictions on political freedom, accept the party's monopoly on power, and accept a social hierarchy that placed loyalty to the national project above individual fulfillment. That contract worked as long as the economy was delivering, as long as every generation genuinely was doing better than the one before, as long as the promise of upward mobility was credible. That contract is now broken, and the lying flat generation is the proof. When millions of young Chinese people decide that striving is pointless, they are not just making a personal lifestyle choice, they are delivering a verdict on the system. They are saying, collectively and undeniably, that the promise is no longer credible, that the upward mobility the party promised is no longer accessible, that the sacrifice the system demands is no longer worth the reward it offers. This is a legitimacy crisis, not the kind that comes with tanks in the street and protesters chanting for democracy, the kind that comes when a population simply stops believing, stops performing belief, stops pretending that the system works when the evidence of their daily lives tells them it does not. And legitimacy crises of this kind are far harder to manage than the visible, confrontational kind, because there is no protest to disperse, no leader to arrest, no movement to infiltrate and disrupt. There's only the spreading, silent withdrawal of a generation from the social and economic project that the party's power depends on. Now add the economic dimension. Because the lying flat movement is not just a cultural phenomenon, it is an economic one, and the economic implications are enormous. China's economic model has depended for decades on a very specific combination of factors. A large, young, hard-working population willing to accept wages and working conditions that workers in other countries would reject. High savings rates that provided the capital for investment. Consumption growth, driven by a middle class that believed its future would be better than its present and spent accordingly. Every single one of those factors is now under stress from the lying flat generation. Young Chinese workers who have decided to do the minimum are less productive. Young Chinese consumers who have decided that acquisition is meaningless spend less. Young Chinese savers who see no future worth saving for change their financial behavior in ways that ripple through the entire economy. And young Chinese people who have decided not to have children, a decision increasingly connected to the same fundamental disillusionment, are contributing to a demographic collapse that threatens the long-term foundations of everything. China's birth rate has fallen to historic lows. The country is aging faster than almost any in history. The demographic dividend that powered China's economic miracle is reversing. And the generation that should be having children, that should be forming families and buying homes and driving the consumption that a modern economy requires, has decided in enormous and growing numbers that the system makes those choices impossible or not worth making. This is not a problem that can be solved with a stimulus package or a new 5-year plan. This is a structural crisis rooted in a fundamental disconnect between what the system promised and what it delivers, playing out in the most intimate decisions of hundreds of millions of individual lives. And Beijing's response has been, to put it diplomatically, completely inadequate. The party's initial reaction to lying flat was suppression. Delete the posts, condemn the attitude in state media, instruct officials to promote the virtues of hard work and struggle, roll out propaganda campaigns celebrating young people who had sacrificed personal happiness for national advancement. This approach failed comprehensively, not because the censorship did not work technically, the posts were deleted, the phrases were filtered, but because the lived reality that produced the sentiment could not be deleted. Every young Chinese person who saw a state media celebration of self-sacrifice looked at their own life and saw the gap between the propaganda and the reality with perfect clarity. Suppression without solutions does not address the underlying problem. It just teaches people to express it differently, in private, in code, in behavior, rather than words. Then Beijing tried a different approach. Officials began acknowledging that young people faced real challenges. New policies were announced to address youth unemployment, to increase affordable housing, to reduce the pressure of the private tutoring industry that had turned childhood into an extension of the educational competition. The crackdown on tech companies, on the gaming industry, on celebrity culture, was partly motivated by a recognition that these industries were absorbing youth energy and attention in ways that the party found threatening. But these policy responses, even the genuine ones, missed the deeper problem. Because the crisis is not primarily about tutoring companies or gaming hours or any specific industry. The crisis is about the fundamental structure of Chinese society and economy, about who benefits and who bears the costs of the Chinese system, about whether the promise of meritocracy and upward mobility was ever real or was always a fiction that served the interests of those already at the top. Those questions cannot be answered with policy tweaks. They require systemic change. And systemic change is the one thing the Communist Party, by its nature, cannot offer without threatening its own monopoly on power. So Beijing is stuck, and the movement keeps spreading. There's a generational dimension to this that deserves careful attention. The young Chinese people driving the lying flat movement are not their parents' generation. They are not the generation that lived through the Cultural Revolution and the poverty of the Mao era and experienced the reform period as a genuine miracle of improving conditions. They did not experience scarcity. They grew up with smartphones and global internet access and exposure to the full range of human possibility. They have higher expectations, not lower, and their disappointment is correspondingly more acute. They are also the most educated generation in Chinese history. University enrollment rates that were in the single digits for their grandparents' generation are now near universal for urban young people. Education was supposed to be the great equalizer. Instead, it has become a credential arms race where the costs keep rising and the returns keep falling. A generation that was told education was the key to success has discovered that the door it was supposed to open does not exist. And crucially, they are connected to each other in ways that previous generations were not. The lying flat movement did not need a political party or an organized leadership structure to spread across a country of 1.4 billion people. It spread through private messaging apps, through coded references that slipped past censors, through the shared recognition of a common experience that needed no explicit articulation because Every young person understood immediately what it was describing. This networked spontaneity is something the Communist Party's control apparatus was not designed to handle. The party's control mechanisms were built for a different era, for an era of top-down information flow where controlling the broadcast meant controlling the message. The internet, even a censored internet, allows horizontal information sharing at a scale and speed that top-down censorship cannot fully contain. What spreads through private group chats, through encrypted messaging apps, through person-to-person conversations that happen in physical spaces where cameras cannot read lips, is beyond the reach of even the most sophisticated surveillance state. And the party knows it. Internal Communist Party documents that have leaked or been analyzed by researchers paint a picture of genuine anxiety at the highest levels about the spread of what officials call nihilistic thought among Chinese youth. The language of these internal discussions is revealing. The party is not just worried about political opposition. It is worried about something deeper and harder to address, the loss of faith in the national project itself. Because the Communist Party's power ultimately rests not just on coercion, but on a narrative. The narrative of national rejuvenation, the narrative of China rising, the narrative of a people whose patience, sacrifice, and unity under party leadership will deliver them to a position of global dignity and domestic prosperity that history denied them for so long. When young people lie flat, they are rejecting that narrative, not by arguing against it, not by proposing an alternative, simply by refusing to participate in it, by saying with their bodies and their choices and their quiet withdrawal that the story the party is telling about China's future is not a story they believe in or a story they are willing to sacrifice for. That is the deepest threat the movement poses, not to this or that policy, not to this or that official, but to the legitimacy narrative that holds the entire system together. Now look at the international implications, because what is happening inside China does not stay inside China. China's economy is the second largest in the world, the engine of global manufacturing, the largest trading partner for most of the world's nations. A country whose economic health has enormous consequences for supply chains, commodity prices, and economic conditions in every corner of the globe. An economy where the young workforce is deliberately minimizing its output, where consumer spending is being consciously reduced by a generation that has decided consumption is not worth the effort, where demographic trends are pointing toward a shrinking workforce and a growing elderly population that requires care and resources that a stagnating economy may struggle to provide. These are not just China's problems, they are global problems. The deflationary pressure already emanating from China's economic slowdown is affecting manufacturing competition worldwide. The reduced Chinese consumer appetite is already being felt by the luxury goods industries of Europe, the commodity exporters of Africa and Latin America, and the technology companies of America and East Asia that had built their growth models on Chinese market expansion. And if the lying flat generation's withdrawal deepens rather than reverses, those effects will intensify. There's also a geopolitical dimension that very few analysts are connecting to the lying flat movement. A Chinese Communist Party facing a domestic legitimacy crisis has historically responded with nationalist escalation. When internal contradictions become too visible, the standard playbook involves redirecting public attention toward external threats, real or constructed, and positioning the party as the defender of national dignity against foreign aggression. Taiwan, the South China Sea, trade conflicts with the United States. All of these pressure points carry the potential for deliberately calibrated escalation that serves domestic political purposes. A population that is quietly withdrawing from the national project might be pulled back toward it by a sufficiently dramatic confrontation with a foreign adversary. The rally around the flag dynamic is real, and Chinese leaders are not ignorant of how it has been used by governments throughout history. But this strategy carries enormous risks, because the generation that is lying flat is also paradoxically the most internationally connected and globally aware generation in Chinese history. They can see through nationalist manipulation with a sophistication that previous generations could not. And there is evidence that many of them are less susceptible to nationalist emotional appeals than the party hopes, precisely because their disillusionment goes so deep that even national pride feels hollow when it comes from a system they no longer trust. A nationalism that cannot fully mobilize its own young people is a nationalism with a structural weakness at its core. And structural weaknesses, in both military and political contexts, tend to reveal themselves at the worst possible moment. What does the future look like? What are the possible trajectories from here? The first possibility is that the movement remains a cultural phenomenon and gradually fades as economic conditions improve. If China's economy manages to generate enough high-quality employment for young graduates, if housing becomes more accessible, if the gap between effort and reward narrows, some portion of the lying flat generation might re-engage with the system's demands. But the structural issues, demographic decline, a property sector that has absorbed enormous wealth and is now unwinding painfully, a technology sector constrained by geopolitical competition and regulatory crackdown, None of these are easily or quickly solved. The second possibility is deepening withdrawal. The movement continues to spread and intensify, becoming not just a youth cultural trend, but a generational defining characteristic. A generation that not only lies flat, but raises its children, if it has children, with a fundamentally different relationship to state authority and social obligation. The long-term consequences of this scenario for Chinese economic dynamism and social cohesion would be severe and potentially irreversible. The third possibility is the one that haunts Beijing most, that the quiet withdrawal of the lying flat generation is a prelude to something louder, that the accumulated disillusionment, the broken promises, the demographic despair, the economic frustration eventually reaches a threshold where lying flat gives way to standing up, not necessarily in the form of organized political opposition, which the security apparatus is well designed to prevent, but in some form, some new expression of the same underlying energy that the party's control mechanisms cannot contain as effectively as they have contained everything that came before. No one knows which of these trajectories China is on, probably not even the people inside Zhongnanhai who spend their days trying to manage this reality. What is certain is that something unprecedented is happening. A population of young people in the world's most populous country, the country whose rise has been the defining geopolitical story of the past 3 decades, is quietly, collectively, and in growing numbers deciding that the system is not worth their participation. Beijing has the cameras. It has the algorithms. It has the neighborhood committees and the internet filters and the vast machinery of social control that is the envy and the nightmare of governments everywhere. But it does not have an answer to a generation that has simply decided to stop. And the movement keeps spreading through private conversations and encrypted messages and the quiet daily choices of hundreds of millions of young people who have looked at what the system offers and decided that lying flat, letting it rot, returning to the village, is a better answer than anything the party has proposed. The cameras are watching, the algorithms are scanning, the sensors are deleting. And in apartments and group chats in rural villages and urban offices across a nation of 1.4 billion people, a generation is making a decision that no camera can capture and no algorithm can reverse. They are deciding to stop, and that decision, quiet as it is, may be the loudest thing happening in the world right now.